The hardest test of a person's character begins the moment they believe no one is watching. On one of the coldest evenings Chicago had seen that winter, Malcolm Reed stepped out of a neighborhood grocery store carrying a single white takeout container in one hand and a worn paper bag tucked beneath his arm. The wind swept through the nearly empty parking lot, carrying loose snow across the cracked pavement as the blinking neon sign reflected against patches of frozen slush. Inside that container was roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. It wasn't much, but it was enough for two people if neither admitted they were still hungry afterward. Malcolm glanced at his watch. It was already 8:47 p.m. Sophie would be sitting at the tiny kitchen table by now, pretending to finish her homework while secretly waiting to hear his truck pull into the parking lot. She never complained when dinner was late. She simply smiled and asked if work had been busy, even though they both knew busy usually meant another extra shift that barely covered rent. Malcolm smiled quietly to himself as he imagined her carefully setting 2 paper plates on the table like she always did, leaving the larger portion for him because she believed fathers needed more food. He had long ago learned to switch the plates when she wasn't looking. As he reached for his keys, he noticed someone sitting alone near the edge of the sidewalk outside the store. A woman wrapped in an oversized gray coat sat with her knees pulled close to her chest. Her shoes were damp from melted snow. Loose strands of dark hair clung to her face as the icy wind refused to leave her alone. She looked exhausted, not dramatic, not theatrical, simply tired in the quiet way people become after carrying invisible weight for too long. Hundreds of customers had already walked past her that evening. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Others glanced for barely a second before looking away. One man dropped a few coins several feet from where she sat without slowing his pace. Another customer muttered that people should stop pretending to be homeless just to get free food. The woman never answered anyone. She simply remained seated, her hands folded together for warmth. Malcolm unlocked his truck, placed one foot inside, then paused. Something about the way she kept staring at the ground reminded him of a memory he had spent years trying not to revisit. After Natalie died, he had once sat outside a hospital parking garage for nearly an hour because he couldn't bring himself to drive home and explain to a 5-year-old girl why her mother wasn't coming back. He remembered how invisible grief could make someone feel. He closed the truck door. The woman slowly looked up as his footsteps approached. Her voice was almost lost beneath the wind. "Excuse me, do you know anywhere I could get something to eat tonight?" Malcolm looked down at the takeout container in his hand. Then he looked toward the apartment building several blocks away where Sophie was waiting. For a long second, he said nothing. Finally, he walked over, lowered himself onto the cold concrete beside the stranger, opened the container, found the plastic fork taped underneath, broke it cleanly in half, and slid exactly half the meal toward her. She blinked in surprise. "Are you sure?" she asked softly. Malcolm gave a tired smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Not really," he admitted. "But hunger doesn't wait until life becomes convenient." The woman hesitated before accepting the food. She watched him carefully as he folded the lid between them like an invisible line neither needed to cross. "What about your dinner?" she asked. Malcolm looked toward the dark sky for just a moment before answering. "My daughter thinks I already ate at work." He said it so casually it almost sounded true. The woman lowered her eyes to the meal resting in front of her. For the first time that day, her carefully practiced composure cracked. She suddenly realized she wasn't eating leftovers. She wasn't accepting charity from someone with extra. She was holding half of a little girl's dinner. 50 yards away, inside a dark delivery van parked across the street, a tiny red recording light blinked silently as someone wearing a headset leaned forward and whispered into a microphone. "We found the one." At that exact moment, Malcolm's phone vibrated. Sophie's name appeared across the screen. He answered with the warmth only fathers seem able to summon after the longest days. "Hey, sweetheart." Her cheerful little voice filled the cold night. "Daddy, should I keep your half warm too?" Malcolm closed his eyes for one brief second before smiling toward the empty street. "Go ahead and eat, sweetheart," he said gently. "I'll be home soon." Across from him, the woman held the fork motionless in her hand, unable to take another bite as the weight of that simple lie settled quietly over both of them. The woman lowered the plastic fork and looked at Malcolm as though she had forgotten every question she had planned to ask that day. She had spent hours walking through the city wearing clothes no one would recognize, carrying no identification, no credit cards, no driver, and no security team. Every luxury had been stripped away on purpose, yet nothing had prepared her for sitting beside a father who quietly gave away food that belonged to his child. Malcolm stood and brushed the snow from his jeans. "Come on," he said. "It is getting colder." She hesitated. "Where are we going?" He shrugged with an almost apologetic smile. "There is an old community kitchen a few blocks away. It is closed this time of night, but I still have a key because I help fix things there once in a while. It will at least get you out of the wind." She studied his face, searching for caution, suspicion, or expectation. She found none. He did not ask for her name. He did not ask how she ended up alone. He did not ask whether she deserved help. He simply walked toward the sidewalk as though kindness required fewer questions than most people believed. She quietly followed him. Neither of them noticed the dark van slowly pulling away from the grocery store several hundred feet behind them. Inside, a man wearing an expensive wool coat watched multiple camera feeds across several monitors. Richard Hale folded his arms with quiet satisfaction. "Interesting," he murmured. He was never on the list. One of the production assistants glanced over. "Should we stop recording now?" Ms. Whitmore wanted everything shut down after sunset. Richard smiled without taking his eyes off the screen. "Keep every camera rolling." Nearly 12 hours earlier, Elena Whitmore had stood inside the executive boardroom on the 39th floor of Whitmore Foods headquarters overlooking downtown Chicago. The walls were made of glass. The conference table stretched nearly 30 feet long, and every chair around it was occupied by people who measured success through quarterly reports and market forecasts. Charts glowed across enormous presentation screens showing growth percentages, operating costs, and charitable investments totaling hundreds of millions of dollars. Vanessa Cole proudly announced that the company had once again been recognized as one of the nation's leading corporate donors fighting food insecurity. Applause circled the room. Then Richard quietly stood. "Before we congratulate ourselves," he said, "I have one question." The room fell silent. Elena nodded for him to continue. Richard placed a thin folder on the polished table. "When was the last time anyone in this room spoke with someone who was actually hungry without telling them who you were?" Nobody answered immediately. Richard continued. "We know donation totals. We know public approval ratings. We know media impressions. We know every statistic except the only one that matters." Elena leaned back in her chair. "And what statistic would that be?" Richard met her eyes. "Whether people still help strangers when there are no cameras, no headlines, and no rewards." Several board members shifted uncomfortably. Elena crossed her hands. "Our mission is feeding people, not testing human nature." Richard calmly slid another document toward her. It was a handwritten letter preserved beneath a clear protective sleeve. "I found this while reviewing your father's archived records." Elena recognized the familiar handwriting before she even picked it up. Her father, Daniel Whitmore, had written the note decades earlier while running the family's first neighborhood diner. The faded ink read, "Before you decide whether a table should stay open, sit at it while you are hungry." For several seconds Elena could not speak. She remembered being 8 years old and watching her father quietly serve free meals to families who promised they would pay someday, even though many never could. He never asked for proof. He never embarrassed anyone. He simply believed that dignity should be served alongside dinner. Richard broke the silence. "Spend one day without your name, your money, or your influence. Then tell this board what kindness actually looks like." Elena slowly folded the letter. "No media." Richard nodded. "Of course. No announcements." Another nod. "No one knows who I am." Agreed. She stood, slipped the letter into her briefcase, and looked out across the Chicago skyline. "One day," she said quietly, "I will see this city the way my father once did." She believed she was testing whether compassion still existed in ordinary people. She never imagined someone else had already decided to turn that search into something entirely different. The old community kitchen sat quietly between a boarded-up hardware store and a laundromat that had already turned off its lights for the night. The faded wooden sign above the entrance still read Brooks Community Kitchen, although years of Chicago winters had nearly erased the paint. Malcolm unlocked the side door with an old brass key that looked as worn as the building itself. The lights flickered once before filling the small dining room with a warm amber glow. There were only 8 tables inside, each covered with simple checkered cloths that Mrs. Evelyn Brooks insisted on washing herself every Sunday, even though the kitchen had officially closed months earlier. Elena stepped inside, rubbing warmth back into her hands while quietly observing everything around her. Nothing inside looked expensive, yet every chair had been pushed neatly beneath its table. Every countertop had been wiped clean. Even the old coffee maker had been polished until it reflected the overhead lights. Malcolm noticed her looking around. Mrs. Brooks always said people deserve a clean place to eat, whether they are paying or not. Elena nodded without speaking. She had spent years walking through restaurants designed by award-winning architects, but somehow this tiny kitchen carried more dignity than many dining rooms she had visited. Malcolm placed the empty takeout container into a trash bin before opening the refrigerator. There was almost nothing left inside. Half an onion, a few carrots, celery that needed to be used soon, 1 small carton of chicken broth. He smiled anyway. That is enough. Elena watched with quiet curiosity as he tied on a faded apron hanging beside the stove. His hands moved confidently across the cutting board with the calm rhythm of someone who had repeated these motions thousands of times. Every slice was clean. Every movement was efficient. There was no wasted effort. Even the way he stirred the soup carried quiet precision. "You cook professionally?" she finally asked. Malcolm chuckled softly. "Not anymore." He left the answer there, giving no explanation. A few minutes later, headlights swept across the front windows. A neighbor pulled into the parking lot with Sophie sitting in the passenger seat wrapped inside a bright blue winter coat that looked slightly too large for her. She hurried through the front door carrying her backpack and smiled the instant she saw her father. "Daddy." Malcolm knelt to hug her tightly. "Thank you for waiting up." Sophie noticed Elena standing nearby and offered a polite smile without hesitation. "Hi." Elena smiled back. "Hello." Malcolm introduced them simply. This lady needed somewhere warm tonight. Sophie accepted the explanation as though helping strangers was the most ordinary thing in the world. She slipped off her backpack and immediately walked toward the cabinet where bowls were stacked. Without asking, she placed 3 bowls on the counter instead of 2. Elena noticed the small gesture. "You knew your father was bringing someone?" Sophie shook her head. "No." "Then why 3 bowls?" Sophie smiled innocently. "Daddy always says if you cook for 2, you should be ready for 3. Malcolm laughed quietly while stirring the soup. "I forgot I taught you that." "You teach me lots of things," Sophie answered proudly. As the soup simmered, Elena watched father and daughter move around the kitchen almost like musicians who already knew each other's timing. Sophie handed him ingredients before he asked. Malcolm reached for towels exactly where Sophie had already placed them. Their conversations were filled with tiny smiles instead of unnecessary words. It was obvious they had built a life together through thousands of ordinary evenings just like this one. While Malcolm divided the soup into bowls, Sophie quietly noticed that her father's portion was smaller than everyone else's. Without saying anything, she gently switched bowls while his back was turned. Elena saw the exchange happen. Malcolm returned carrying slices of bread, stopped for a second, and immediately realized what his daughter had done. Instead of correcting her, he simply smiled with quiet pride. During dinner, Sophie looked toward Elena. "Do you have any kids?" Elena paused longer than she expected. "No." Sophie nodded thoughtfully before saying, "Then you can borrow my dad until the weather gets better. He makes everybody feel safe." The words landed harder than the child could possibly know. Elena looked at Malcolm, who suddenly seemed embarrassed by the compliment. He simply shrugged. "She has always had a generous imagination." Sophie giggled. "No, Daddy. I just tell the truth." After they finished eating, Malcolm began washing the dishes while Elena wandered toward an old bulletin board covered with faded photographs from years ago. Most showed volunteers serving meals to families during holidays. In nearly every picture, Malcolm stood behind enormous pots wearing a white chef's jacket instead of the work clothes he wore now. Elena turned slowly toward him. "You were not just a cook, were you?" Malcolm rinsed another bowl before answering. "There was a time when feeding people was my full-time job." Before Elena could ask another question, something outside caught her attention. Across the street, reflected faintly in the dark window, a tiny red light blinked once, then disappeared. Her heartbeat slowed. She recognized that light immediately. It was the recording indicator from one of the remote cameras that should have been shut down hours ago. Elena kept her eyes fixed on the dark window as the tiny red reflection vanished into the snowy night. She knew that light. It belonged to one of the compact remote cameras used during confidential field research, and it should have been turned off hours ago. A quiet uneasiness settled over her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. Malcolm finished drying the last bowl and placed it neatly on the shelf before noticing her expression. "Everything all right?" he asked. Elena glanced back toward him and managed a small smile. "I thought I saw something outside. Probably just a passing car." Malcolm walked to the front window, looked into the empty street, and shrugged. "Not much happens around here after 9 o'clock unless somebody loses their way." Sophie climbed onto one of the old wooden chairs and rested her chin in her hands. "People find this place when they are hungry," she said. "Daddy says hunger always knows the address." Malcolm laughed softly. "I might have said something like that once." Sophie pointed toward an old framed photograph hanging beside the serving counter. "Mom used to say it too." Elena slowly walked over to the picture. It showed Malcolm several years younger wearing a crisp white chef's coat beside a smiling woman with bright eyes and gentle confidence. Between them stood a much younger Sophie, wearing an apron nearly as large as she was. Fresh bread covered the table in front of them, and every face in the photograph carried the kind of happiness that could not be purchased. Elena studied the picture for several quiet seconds before asking, "Your wife worked here too?" Malcolm nodded while folding kitchen towels. Natalie believed nobody should have to explain why they needed a meal. She thought dignity tasted better than charity. His voice remained steady, but Elena could hear the quiet affection that time had never erased. Sophie smiled as she looked at the same photograph. "Mom always baked cornbread on Saturdays because she said it made the whole building smell like hope." Malcolm gently touched the corner of the frame before turning away. She had a way of making ordinary things feel important. Elena felt something shift inside her. She had spent years approving charitable budgets measured in millions of dollars. Yet this family remembered love through the smell of fresh bread and shared soup. The contrast was impossible to ignore. A cold gust rattled the front windows, and Sophie suddenly remembered something. She hurried toward a small storage closet and returned carrying a folded quilt with faded blue stitching. "You can use this tonight," she said as she held it out to Elena. Malcolm immediately recognized it. "Soph," he said gently, "that was your mother's blanket." Sophie looked down at the quilt for only a moment before lifting her eyes again. Mom would not want someone to be cold. Malcolm stared at his daughter with quiet admiration. He knew exactly what she was giving away. The blanket had traveled with Natalie through years of family camping trips, hospital visits, and sleepless nights after Sophie was born. It was one of the few things they had never packed away. Elena accepted it carefully, almost afraid to touch it. "I cannot take something this special." Sophie smiled with the simple certainty only children sometimes possess. "It is special because somebody uses it when they need it." Elena wrapped the quilt around her shoulders and felt unexpected warmth spread through more than just her hands. Nobody in the boardroom would have understood the value of what had just happened. There was no contract, no publicity, no financial return, only quiet generosity offered without hesitation. While Sophie began organizing chairs for the morning volunteers who would arrive later in the week, Malcolm checked the old furnace in the back room. Elena stepped toward the entrance and looked through the narrow glass panel in the door. Across the street, she noticed movement near a parked vehicle. The same faint red light appeared again for the briefest instant before disappearing behind tinted glass. This time she was certain. Someone was still recording everything. She reached into the pocket of the borrowed coat she had been wearing all day, searching instinctively for the phone that was no longer there because she had surrendered it before the experiment began. A wave of frustration crossed her face. She had trusted Richard to honor their agreement. Instead, someone had ignored her instructions completely. Inside the van, Richard leaned forward with growing excitement as fresh footage streamed across multiple monitors. He watched Malcolm laugh with Sophie while Elena sat quietly beneath Natalie's quilt, and he smiled as though every moment unfolding before him belonged to the company instead of the family creating it. One of the camera operators hesitated before speaking. "This feels different now. Maybe we should stop." Richard never looked away from the screen. "Absolutely not," he replied. "By tomorrow morning, the entire country will know this man's face." Morning arrived with a pale gray sky stretching over Chicago as fresh snow settled quietly across the sidewalks. Malcolm woke before sunrise, folded Natalie's quilt exactly the way Sophie had shown him years earlier, and gently placed it over the chair where Elena had rested. The small community kitchen was silent except for the hum of the old refrigerator and the soft whistle of the furnace. Sophie was already awake, coloring at one of the tables with a box of crayons that had long since lost their labels. Elena stepped from the back room, still wrapped in the borrowed coat, carrying the folded quilt carefully in both hands. "Thank you," she said quietly as she handed it back. Sophie smiled. "It kept you warm. That is what it is for." Malcolm accepted the blanket with a grateful nod before placing it inside the storage closet. He noticed Elena studying the kitchen one last time. "You heading somewhere?" he asked. She hesitated. "I suppose I am." He reached into a cabinet and removed a paper cup with a plastic lid before filling it with fresh coffee. "It is not fancy," he said with an apologetic smile. "But it is hot." Elena accepted it with both hands. "It is perfect." She wanted to tell him who she really was. She wanted to explain the cameras, the experiment, and the promise Richard had broken. But every sentence she imagined sounded like an excuse instead of the truth. Before she could speak again, Malcolm's old cell phone vibrated across the counter. He glanced at the screen and answered. It was his supervisor from the warehouse. Malcolm listened quietly for several moments before responding with calm professionalism. "I understand. Thank you for letting me know." He ended the call without raising his voice. Sophie immediately recognized the expression on her father's face. "Did they need you to work another shift?" she asked hopefully. Malcolm forced a reassuring smile. "No, sweetheart. They are making some schedule changes." Sophie nodded slowly, pretending to believe him even though she sensed something had gone wrong. Elena watched the exchange with growing concern, but before she could ask anything, another phone inside the kitchen began buzzing. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks answered from home through the old office speaker system that still worked after all these years. "Malcolm," she said excitedly, "turn on the television. Right now." Malcolm picked up the remote from the counter and switched on the small television hanging in the corner of the dining room. Every face in the room froze. Across the screen appeared crystal-clear footage from the previous night. There was Malcolm sitting beside Elena outside the grocery store, carefully dividing the takeout container into 2 equal portions. There was Sophie setting out 3 bowls without being asked. There was Natalie's quilt wrapped around Elena's shoulders. A dramatic narrator declared, "One stranger reminded an entire city what kindness looks like." Malcolm stared silently at the screen. Elena felt the color drain from her face. Richard had ignored every instruction she had given him. The footage continued with emotional music layered beneath carefully selected moments, transforming private acts of compassion into polished entertainment. Sophie's voice filled the television. "You can borrow my dad until the weather gets better." Malcolm immediately reached for the remote and muted the broadcast. The room became painfully quiet. "How did they get this?" he asked softly. Elena lowered her eyes. Before she could answer, the television displayed a familiar corporate logo followed by an announcement that Whitmore Foods would host a live event later that afternoon to honor the anonymous father whose generosity had inspired millions overnight. Malcolm looked back at the silent screen, then toward Elena. Something inside him began connecting pieces that had not fit together before. The expensive stitching hidden beneath her worn coat. The confidence she carried despite pretending to be lost. The way she had recognized the blinking red light outside the window. Elena could see realization slowly reaching his eyes, and for the first time since the experiment had begun, she wished she had never agreed to it at all. Outside the kitchen, several cars began slowing as drivers recognized the building from the viral video. A few people stopped on the sidewalk, pointing toward the windows while lifting their phones. What had been a quiet refuge only hours earlier was becoming a destination. Malcolm looked through the glass at the growing crowd, then back at Sophie, who stood confused beside the table clutching one of her crayons. He did not seem excited by the attention. He only looked worried. 50 blocks away, Richard watched live viewership numbers climb higher with every passing minute. He smiled as investors flooded his phone with congratulatory messages. The campaign was already exceeding every projection, and he believed he had just discovered the most valuable story money could never buy. By noon, the quiet street outside Brooks' community kitchen no longer looked like itself. News vans lined the curb, photographers gathered behind temporary barriers, and strangers stood shoulder to shoulder, hoping to catch a glimpse of the father whose simple act of generosity had spread across every major television network. Malcolm locked the front door before turning towards Sophie, who sat at one of the tables with her backpack still on because they had never made it to school that morning. She looked through the window at the growing crowd with confusion instead of excitement. "Daddy, why are all those people here?" Malcolm knelt beside her and answered honestly. "Because sometimes people notice the wrong part of a story." Before Sophie could ask another question, a line of black sport utility vehicles rolled slowly to the curb. The doors opened almost in perfect sequence. Men and women wearing business attire stepped out first, followed by camera crews carrying microphones and bright lights. Finally, Elena emerged, no longer wearing the worn gray coat from the night before. She stood in a navy wool coat with understated elegance, her expression carrying none of the confidence the public expected from one of the most successful business leaders in America. Behind her walked Richard Hale with a polished smile and Vanessa Cole directing photographers into position. Two assistants carefully carried an oversized ceremonial check displaying $1 million beside the Whitmore Foods logo. Richard looked at the crowd and quietly nodded with satisfaction. Every camera immediately pointed toward the entrance. Vanessa stepped forward and addressed the reporters. "Today we celebrate an extraordinary act of compassion and the remarkable family who reminded all of us that kindness still exists." Applause rippled through the gathering. Malcolm opened the door only wide enough to step outside before closing it gently behind him. He wanted Sophie to remain inside, away from the cameras. Elena took one slow step toward him. "Malcolm," she began softly, "I owe you an explanation." He looked at her calmly. "You owe my daughter one first." The sentence stopped everyone. Even the reporters lowered their microphones for a moment. Richard quickly recovered. "This is a joyful occasion," he interrupted. "Let us focus on the positive. Whitmore Foods is honored to present Mr. Reed with this award for his inspiring generosity." The assistants lifted the oversized check as flashes from dozens of cameras illuminated the snowy sidewalk. Malcolm did not move toward it. Instead, he looked directly at Elena. "Did you know they were recording us after you told them to stop?" Elena lowered her eyes. "No." "Did you know my little girl was filmed without anyone asking her?" "No." "Did you know my private kitchen, my late wife's blanket, and my daughter's voice became part of a national campaign before sunrise?" Elena answered with painful honesty. "I found out this morning." Richard stepped between them with practiced confidence. "We can discuss all of that privately after the ceremony. Right now, America wants to thank you." Malcolm slowly shook his head. "America does not know me." The crowd fell silent again. He turned toward the cameras, not with anger, but with steady dignity. "Last night I shared food because someone was hungry. I did not agree to sell my family's hardest moments so strangers could feel inspired for 30 seconds before changing the channel." Vanessa quietly signaled one of the producers to lower the microphones, but every network was already broadcasting live. Malcolm continued, "This check is generous, but it cannot buy back my daughter's privacy. It cannot return a quiet meal. It cannot erase the fact that nobody asked whether we wanted our lives turned into a story." Richard forced a diplomatic smile. "Surely you understand the good this attention can accomplish." Malcolm met his eyes. Good built on someone else's dignity is still the wrong foundation. He gently placed both hands on the edge of the oversized check and pushed it back toward the assistants without unfolding it or looking at the amount. A wave of whispers spread through the crowd. Reporters exchanged stunned glances. No one had expected the man who needed money the most to refuse it in front of millions of viewers. At that exact moment, the front door opened slightly behind Malcolm. Sophie stepped onto the porch before anyone could stop her. She looked up at the rows of cameras and then at her father. In a clear, innocent voice, she asked, "Daddy, are they here because you gave away our dinner?" Malcolm smiled gently. "Yes, sweetheart." She looked around at the reporters, then back at Elena, and quietly said, "He gave her food because nobody was watching." Every microphone captured the sentence. Every camera recorded the silence that followed. Elena closed her eyes for a brief moment as the full weight of what had happened settled upon her. She realized that no donation, no publicity campaign, and no public ceremony could repair what had already been taken from this family. Across the street, inside another waiting vehicle, Richard watched the live ratings climb even higher, believing the unexpected rejection had only made the story more valuable, while Elena finally understood that the cost of one simple meal had become far greater than anyone had imagined. The crowd slowly began to dissolve as reporters chased new headlines, but Malcolm knew the cameras had not truly left. They had only moved farther away. By late afternoon, Brooks' community kitchen was quiet again except for the occasional car slowing down outside before driving away. Sophie sat at one of the tables drawing another picture with her crayons. This time she sketched 3 bowls of soup around a small table and carefully colored an empty chair beside them. Malcolm stood near the window, watching the last television van disappear around the corner. He had barely slept, lost his job that morning, and watched his family's private life become public property before lunch, yet his greatest concern remained the little girl humming softly behind him. A gentle knock came at the back door. Malcolm opened it expecting Mrs. Brooks, but Elena stood alone on the steps wearing a simple dark coat with no photographers, no assistants, and no security detail. The black sport utility vehicles were gone. The oversized check was gone. Even her expensive jewelry had disappeared. She looked less like the chief executive of a global company and more like the tired woman who had asked for food the night before. "May I come in?" she asked quietly. Malcolm stepped aside without saying a word. Sophie looked up from her drawing and smiled politely. "Hi." Elena smiled back. "Hello, Sophie." She noticed the crayons scattered across the table and the picture of 3 bowls. "That is beautiful." Sophie shrugged with the honesty of a child. "Daddy says every table should always have one extra place, just in case." Elena swallowed quietly. Every simple sentence this family spoke seemed to remind her of something money had never taught her. Malcolm poured 3 cups of coffee, replacing Sophie's with hot chocolate, then sat across from Elena. For several moments, neither adult spoke. Finally, Elena broke the silence. "I am sorry." Malcolm nodded once. "I believe you are." She looked surprised. "You do?" "Yes," he answered calmly. "But being sorry and making something right are not the same thing." Elena accepted the truth without argument. "You deserve to know everything." She explained the board meeting, her father's letter, the agreement to spend one anonymous day in the city, and the promise Richard had made to keep every camera turned off after sunset. She admitted that she had recognized the recording light outside the kitchen, but had no way to stop it. Malcolm listened without interrupting. When she finished, he quietly asked, "Did you choose me?" "No." "Did your company?" "No." "Then who did?" Elena hesitated. "Richard." Malcolm leaned back slowly. "So somebody decided my daughter would become part of a national campaign without asking either one of us." Elena lowered her eyes. "Yes." Sophie looked between them without fully understanding the conversation. Malcolm waited until she returned to her drawing before speaking again. "Do you know what upset me the most?" Elena expected him to mention losing his job or refusing the money. Instead, he pointed gently toward Sophie. "She spent this morning wondering whether helping people is dangerous." The sentence struck Elena harder than any public criticism ever could. Malcolm continued in the same steady voice. "Children learn by watching us. Last night, she watched me share dinner. This morning, she watched strangers turn that dinner into entertainment. I cannot let her believe kindness always comes with a price." Elena felt tears gathering but refused to hide behind them. "Tell me how to fix this." Malcolm slowly shook his head. "You cannot fix yesterday." His phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen and answered. The call lasted less than a minute. When he ended it, he looked neither angry nor surprised. "What happened?" Elena asked. "A parent from Sophie's school," Malcolm replied. "Some children have already seen the video. They started asking whether Sophie is famous now." He smiled sadly. "She is 8 years old. She should be worried about spelling tests, not internet comments." Elena quietly reached into her shoulder bag and removed a thin folder. "There is something else you need to see." Inside were copies of old corporate acquisition records from nearly 6 years earlier. Malcolm scanned the first page, then froze. Across the top appeared the name of the restaurant where he had once served as executive chef before it closed without warning. Below it was the unmistakable logo of Whitmore Foods. Elena spoke softly. "I found these an hour ago." Richard led the acquisition himself. Malcolm turned another page and found budget recommendations, restructuring plans, and one sentence highlighted in yellow. Community meal program to be discontinued immediately due to insufficient profit margin. His eyes stopped moving. Elena continued with visible regret. The kitchen where you fed families every Saturday was closed during that merger. I did not know the details. I signed the final approval because I trusted the reports placed in front of me. Malcolm looked at the papers for a long time before quietly asking, "Do you realize what this means?" Elena nodded slowly. "My company took away the work that allowed you to feed people, and years later, you still shared your last meal with me." The room fell silent. Outside, snow drifted gently across the empty sidewalk. Inside, neither of them noticed that across the city Richard had already approved the release of another edited video, one carefully arranged to suggest that Malcolm had recognized Elena from the beginning and had staged the entire encounter for money, setting into motion a second betrayal that would test every ounce of trust either of them still possessed. The following morning, Chicago woke to another wave of headlines, but this time they carried a very different story. Television anchors questioned whether Malcolm Reed had recognized Elena Whitmore from the beginning. Social media clips appeared showing carefully edited moments that suggested he had deliberately approached her for attention. The truth had been rearranged until it looked believable. Outside Brooks' community kitchen, fewer people came to offer thanks, while more arrived carrying opinions they had borrowed from strangers online. Malcolm refused to answer any reporters. Instead, he walked Sophie to school as he always had, holding her backpack over one shoulder while she held his hand. Halfway there, she looked up at him. "Daddy, did you do something bad?" Malcolm stopped walking, knelt, until they were eye to eye, and smiled with the same quiet patience he had shown her since she was little. "No, sweetheart. Sometimes people only hear part of a story. That does not change the truth." She nodded slowly. "Then I will believe the part one saw." Malcolm squeezed her hand gently before she disappeared through the school doors. Those simple words stayed with him for the rest of the day. Across town, Elena sat alone inside the executive conference room where everything had begun. The enormous screens now displayed falling public approval numbers, legal notices, and emergency meeting requests from board members. Richard Hale stood confidently at the opposite end of the table. "The public loves redemption stories," he said. "If we let this run another 48 hours, then reveal additional footage proving Mr. Reed is innocent, the campaign will be even stronger." Elena stared at him in disbelief. "You still think this is a campaign?" Richard folded his hands. "Everything is a campaign. People will forget the details. They always do." Elena slowly opened the folder containing the complete, unedited recordings from every hidden camera. There was Malcolm quietly sharing his dinner. There was Sophie offering Natalie's quilt without hesitation. There was every private conversation Richard had promised would never be recorded. Elena looked around the table at directors who suddenly seemed unable to meet her eyes. "You all watched this happen," she said quietly. No one answered. "You watched a grieving family become marketing material." Richard interrupted calmly. "We inspired millions." Elena shook her head. "No, they inspired millions. We exploited them." The room fell silent. She stood and connected a secure drive to the conference system. Every unedited recording appeared on the screens exactly as it had happened, without dramatic music, selective cuts, or misleading narration. Malcolm's words remained simple. Sophie's kindness remained genuine. Nothing needed embellishment because the truth carried its own weight. Elena pressed one final button. "Send every file to our legal department, every national news outlet, and every member of the board." Several executives gasped. Richard stepped forward. "You cannot release confidential material." Elena met his eyes without hesitation. "It stopped being confidential the moment you violated my instructions." Security personnel quietly entered the room after receiving Elena's earlier request. They approached Richard respectfully and informed him that his access to company systems had been suspended pending an independent investigation. Richard looked around for support, but found none. For the first time since the experiment began, he realized he no longer controlled the story. Later that afternoon, every major network interrupted regular programming for a live statement from Elena Whitmore. She stood behind a simple podium without corporate banners or promotional displays. "Several days ago," she began, "I agreed to an experiment that I believed would help me understand compassion. Instead, I allowed my company to violate the privacy of people who had shown extraordinary generosity. Malcolm Reed never sought recognition. His daughter never agreed to become part of a public campaign. The responsibility belongs entirely to me. She did not ask for forgiveness. She did not mention company achievements or charitable donations. She publicly released the original recordings, acknowledged the manipulation that had created the false narrative, announced an independent review of every executive decision connected to the incident, and accepted full responsibility for approving policies she had failed to examine closely enough. Before leaving the podium, she made one final announcement. Effective immediately, I am stepping down as Chief Executive Officer while this investigation proceeds. Accountability begins with the person responsible. Across the city, Malcolm watched the broadcast from the small television inside Brooks' community kitchen. Mrs. Brooks stood beside him in silence while Sophie colored another picture at the corner table. When the broadcast ended, Malcolm reached for the remote, but stopped as Sophie looked up from her drawing. "Is she telling the truth now?" she asked. Malcolm watched the blank television screen for a long moment before answering. "I think she finally is." That evening, just after sunset, Elena returned to the community kitchen alone, carrying no cameras, no reporters, and no legal documents. In her hands was a small envelope. She placed it gently on the table in front of Malcolm. Inside was a signed agreement transferring complete ownership of every photograph, recording, and piece of footage involving Malcolm or Sophie back to their family, along with a written statement guaranteeing that nothing could ever be published again without their permission. Malcolm read every page carefully before sliding the envelope closed. Without saying a word, he removed one small flash drive from inside and handed it back to Elena. "Keep only one clip," he said quietly. "Which one?" she asked. Malcolm smiled toward Sophie, who was helping Mrs. Brooks set 3 bowls on the table even though there were only 3 people in the room. "The one where my daughter reminded the world that kindness matters most when nobody expects to be seen. Everything else belongs to our family." 1 year later, the first snowfall of December settled gently across the sidewalks outside a newly restored brick building where fresh paint covered the weathered sign that now read Natalie's Table. There was no corporate logo beneath the name, no executive title, and no polished slogan promising to change the world. Instead, a simple line carved into the wood welcomed every person who stepped through the front door. "No one eats alone." Every morning before sunrise, Malcolm unlocked the entrance with the same old brass key he had carried for years. The dining room was larger now, but it still held the same warmth that had once filled Brooks' community kitchen. The checkered tablecloths had returned. Fresh bread cooled on wooden racks near the kitchen. The smell of homemade soup drifted through the room long before the first guests arrived. Some customers quietly paid for their meals. Others left extra money to cover someone they would never meet. Those who could not afford lunch simply sat down and ate without explaining their circumstances. Nobody asked uncomfortable questions. Nobody counted who deserved compassion. Malcolm had insisted on one: rule above every other policy. Every person who entered the dining room would be treated with the same dignity, whether they paid $100 or nothing at all. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks smiled every afternoon from her favorite corner table, proudly greeting neighbors who had once believed the old kitchen would never reopen. Sophie, now a little taller and carrying herself with growing confidence, spent weekends helping serve soup, greeting every guest with the same bright smile that had once convinced a stranger she could borrow her father until the storm passed. She had also finally taken the school field trip she missed the previous year, not because someone had purchased the opportunity for her, but because she had spent months designing handmade greeting cards that the restaurant sold beside the register. Every dollar she earned went into a small savings jar labeled Dreams. Malcolm refused to let success teach her that every blessing had to arrive through rescue. Across the room, Elena quietly folded clean napkins before arranging them on each table. She no longer occupied a corner office overlooking the city skyline. Following the investigation, she had permanently stepped away from leading Whitmore Foods. The independent review exposed years of decisions that had valued efficiency over humanity, and the board accepted sweeping reforms before appointing new leadership. Elena could have returned after the investigation concluded, but she chose a different path. She established a charitable trust that helped restore neighborhood community kitchens across the city without placing her name on a single building. She visited Natalie's table every Wednesday, not as an owner, investor, or public figure, but simply as another volunteer willing to wash dishes, prepare vegetables, and listen to stories from people who needed someone willing to hear them. She and Malcolm had grown close over the passing seasons, though neither rushed to define what their friendship might someday become. Trust had been rebuilt slowly, one ordinary day after another, exactly the way it had first been broken. Sometimes they shared coffee after closing. Sometimes they sat quietly while Sophie finished homework at the corner table. Their conversations no longer revolved around apologies. Instead, they discussed recipes, neighborhood families, and new ideas for serving more people without taking away anyone's dignity. One snowy evening, just before closing time, the front door opened and an elderly woman stepped inside, brushing snow from her worn coat. She looked around nervously before approaching the counter. "I am sorry," she said softly. "I thought I had enough money for dinner, but I must have counted wrong." She opened her purse and placed a few coins on the counter with visible embarrassment. Malcolm glanced at the coins for only a second before smiling warmly. "Please choose any seat you like." The woman hesitated. "I can only afford half a meal." Before Malcolm could answer, Elena quietly carried a warm bowl of soup to the table along with a basket of fresh bread. She sat across from the woman, broke the bread in half, and placed one piece on the stranger's plate without saying a word. Malcolm watched from behind the counter, and a gentle smile crossed his face. Sophie noticed the familiar gesture immediately. She walked over carrying an extra spoon and placed it beside the bowl before looking up at both adults. "See," she said with quiet satisfaction, "there is always enough when nobody eats alone." The elderly woman smiled through grateful tears, unaware that the simple moment she had just witnessed carried the ending of a story that had begun with one divided takeout container on a freezing winter night. As the last guests left and the lights dimmed, Malcolm locked the front door and looked around the dining room, filled with empty chairs waiting for tomorrow's visitors. He realized that the greatest reward had never been money, recognition, or public praise. It was watching his daughter grow into the kind of person who believed generosity should never depend on who was receiving it. Elena stood beside him, and for a quiet moment neither of them spoke. They simply looked at the small wooden sign above the entrance. "No one eats alone." A year earlier those words would have sounded like an impossible dream. Now they had become the promise that guided every meal served inside those walls. Somewhere beyond the falling snow, the city continued rushing through another ordinary evening. But inside that little restaurant one truth remained unchanged. Kindness had never been valuable because it might someday be rewarded. It was valuable because, even in the hardest moments, it allowed ordinary people to remind one another that every human life deserved a place at the table, and that was a legacy far greater than wealth could ever purchase.